So it is my joy and pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Amy Panton. Her list of experience and expertise and contributions to the ongoing conversation about disability, mental health, and theology is extensive. She is the founder and co-editor of the Canadian Journal of Theology, Mental Health, and Disability. She is the co-host of the Mad and Crip Theology podcast series. And if you haven't had a chance to check them out, I would encourage you at some point to venture over to YouTube and look them up. There are some really provocative and interesting conversations that happen on that podcast series. She is the founder and the co-editor of the Mad and Crip Theology Press, a boutique micro press committed to publishing important stories written by people with lived experience. And she is one of the founding members of the Mad, Crip, and Care Collective, a group of women who are committed to amplifying the voices of people with mental health issues, disability, and caregivers as well. She's also a PhD candidate at Emmanuel College at TST because, she probably had a little bit of free time after all of those other things. Where she is in the final few months of completing a dissertation exploring theology and mental distress, in particular, its relationship to self-injury. She teaches in the field of mental health and theology at Emmanuel College, as well at, here at Martin Luther University College in the continuing ed program. Much of Amy's work focuses on amplifying the voices, experience, and stories of people with lived experience. In particular, her work with both the journal and the press emphasizes the importance of sharing stories and expertise that may not normally be heard. And she's often challenging the definition of who holds knowledge and who holds expertise, asking us to think more creatively about how important voices contribute to important conversations. She also has a background in film and art, which she's bringing to her current work, I believe, today. And her work challenges us to expand and perhaps even disrupt our traditional theology and our sense of God. She's a popular speaker, and I am incredibly grateful that she is willing to share some of her time and expertise with us today. So I'm going to hand it over to Amy for the next little while and look forward to her conversation. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Laura. And thank you to everyone for being here today. I so appreciate you taking the time to come and listen and learn and hopefully have a great discussion together at the end. So today I'm going to share some of my reflections on how reimagining God images can be helpful and healing for people with lived experience of mental distress. Before we look at the images, I would like to give you some background about my talk. I am currently writing my PhD dissertation, as Laura mentioned, on how the church can respond to the crisis of self-injury, which is happening in Canada and in other countries around the world. For those who don't know what self-injury is, it's when people cut, burn, or bruise themselves when they are experiencing very difficult emotions, because self-injury can help them to cope. A lot of young people self-injure, and during the pandemic, the self-injury statistics have skyrocketed and become alarmingly high for young people who are cut off from their social supports at school, anxious about the pandemic, living in stressful home conditions, and unable to see their friends. In my dissertation research, I am exploring the history of self-injury in medicine and culture, as well as in theological literature. I then present findings from memoirs written by people who self-injure, listening to the voices of the memoirists concerning next steps on how the church, family members, and the mental health system can respond to this crisis. What surprised me when I was reading through the 20 memoirs from my dissertation is that relationships with God and the ways God is understood is central to many of the memoirists' experiences of mental distress. For my presentation today, I'm bringing forward some of the insights and wisdom from the memoirists and also offering some reflections on God images that I believe would be helpful to bring into the conversation. Some of the God images may be familiar to you, while others may be completely new and may even feel provocative. And that's okay. We will have time for quiet writing and reflection during the presentation, so you can gather your thoughts as we move along. We will also have time for questions and discussion at the end, so I would ask you to write down your questions and hold them till the end. I also want to give a content warning that in this presentation, I will be talking about self-injury, sexual abuse, heteropatriarchal oppression, and psychiatric hospital stays. So I invite you to take good care of yourself as you listen today. As I have been doing my dissertation work over the past few years, I've also had the privilege of teaching about mental health and theology, like Laura mentioned before. When I teach my students about some of the God images that we are about to explore together, I ask them to picture themselves standing in an art gallery. And so here is an image to help set the mood, which shows students walking through an art gallery and pausing to look at art. So if you can imagine yourself, along with the rest of the group, moving through the art gallery as I speak, I think it will help. Try to keep an open mind and to stay curious about the God images today. Okay, so let's begin our gallery tour. Follow me and I will be your guide. The first step on the tour today is to help us to get some background knowledge about the God image. So what is the God image? A helpful way to define the God image is in the relation to the God concept. The God concept refers to our intellectual understanding of God, which is primarily based on what we are taught about God in Sunday school, at Bible studies, and in sermons. On the other hand, the God image is the personal, emotional, and subjective experience of God, which is often informed by our relationship with our parents. The concept of a psychoanalytic understanding of God comes from Anna Maria Rizzuto's pioneering work in this area, where she studied how the life histories and religious experiences of 25 psychiatric patients impacted their personal representations of God and how these patients conceived of God throughout their life cycle. Rizzuto's research focuses on understanding the hopes, loves, resentments, and fears associated with each of the patient's image of God. So right now, there's a picture on the screen of an image of one of the patient's drawings of God from Rizzuto's study. And here, God has a very long beard with short hair. And underneath the image, the patient has written a description that says, God is extremely wise, but sad at man's inhumanity to man, also patient and sensitive to the suffering of mankind. So now we're going to do a little activity together. We're just going to think for a moment about our own God images. So I want you to think in your mind, or if you have a scrap piece of paper near you, you can doodle about what does your current God image look like? And you do not need to be an artist to do this. It's okay if you draw some stick figures, but let's just take a moment to think about our own God image. What does God look like in your mind? I'll just give a few more moments for you to doodle or think about God. So I'm going to invite you to come back, and I'm sure I see there are some artists in our group. I'm sure you made something wonderful. Mine is a horrible stick figure, but that's okay. And I'm sure that this will help you as we're moving forward with my talk, and it will inspire some good theological reflection as well. So I've become more aware of the need for a reimagining of our God images as I have taught the classes on mental health and theology that Laura mentioned over the past few years. During one of my lectures, I begin with a discussion of disability theologian Nancy Eiesland's radical image of God, in which God sits in a SIPCOF wheelchair, a wheelchair that is used predominantly by people with quadriplegia. And for those who attended my friend Reverend Miriam Spee's talk 2 weeks ago, she also referenced Eiesland's pioneering work. So Eiesland explains that with this image of God, God is not omnipotent, but neither is God pitiable. Instead, God is a survivor. After I present this image of God in class, I usually ask for a show of hands, signifying who has seen this image of God before. It's astonishing to me that most of the students in my classes have never encountered the survivor God in the past. So on the screen right now is an image of an artist's sculpture that depicts Jesus using a wheelchair. And Jesus is wearing a white robe with a crimson sash around his shoulders, and he's seated in a wheelchair. So why is it that we do not talk about this image of God as much as I think we should? Perhaps it's because it reveals a God that is too vulnerable, and this makes us uncomfortable. The omnipotent God that many of us learn about in Sunday school would never need to use a wheelchair, let alone ask for help from somebody else. Now that we've seen Eiesland's God image, let's keep moving together through the art gallery. Today, we will view 3 additional images of God that I believe are helpful for people with lived experience of mental distress. And after we view each image, I will share some insights with you from the memoirs for my dissertation that connect to each image. So the first image that would be helpful for people with lived experience of mental distress is from the Eisenheim altarpiece. Here, Christ is depicted with painful sores on his skin. The altarpiece was painted in the early 1500s by German Renaissance painter Matthias Grunewald for the monastery of St. Anthony in Eisenheim, France. The Anthonite hospices, such as St. Anthony's, cared for patients suffering from various skin diseases, such as St. Anthony's fire, which is also known as ergotism. Ergotism was a form of poisoning that affected patients following the ingestion of bread that contained rye and that had developed a parasitic fungus through contamination. People affected by ergotism experienced severe pain in their limbs, which could progress to burning sensations and necrotic tissue in the extremities. As the disease progressed, they would often experience convulsions, hallucinations, severe pockmarks on their skin, and even episodes of mania. And on the screen right now, there's an image of the top part of the Eisenheim altarpiece. Here, Christ is depicted as being affected by ergotism, just like the patients who were staying in the Anthonite hospices. And now I'm showing a close-up image of the painting that details Christ's hands and feet. Christ's skin is covered with blemishes and is a shade of ghastly green. His hands are curled due to muscle spasms, and he bleeds from his hands and feet. Here we see an image of Jesus who is suffering from the same skin afflictions as the patients in the monastery, providing them with a mirror image of the divine who understands their physical, mental, and spiritual pain. This depiction of Christ expands our usual repertoire of God images, providing us with an image of God who has experienced painful wounds on his skin, as well as hallucinations and even manic episodes. People with lived experience of mental distress can look at this image of God and see their own reflection. This Christ knows what hallucinations and manic episodes feel like. Turning now to the memoirs that I have been reading for my dissertation, although none of the memoirists make an overt statement about the connection between Christ's wounds and their wounds from self-injury, Memoirist Sophie Scott alludes to the blurred lines between her body and Christ's body in her memoir, Crying Scarlet Tears, My Journey Through Self-Harm. She writes that when she would self-injure herself as a teenager, she believed that the wound she inflicted upon herself also hurt God. She writes, when I was 16, my self-harm seemed to reach its worst level in terms of frequency. I would cut myself almost every day and sometimes more than once a day. It seemed to be ruling my life. It felt as though I had no control over it and as though I was simply surviving between each injuring session. Every night, whether I'd hurt myself or not, I would go to bed and put on some Christian music and cry to God. I still knew that He didn't want me to be doing this, and I hated the fact that I was hurting Him by hurting myself. Images of God, such as the one of Christ in the Eisenheim altarpiece, could be a helpful resource for Sophie and for others who self-injure. Seeing Christ's skin covered with wounds could be healing for her, as she would see that Christ shares in her pain, combined with notions that this is not the end of the story, that resurrection will certainly come. The second God image that I think would be helpful for people with lived experience of mental distress connects with feminine images of the divine. So feminist theologians have been arguing for the importance of gender-inclusive and female-gendered language for God for decades. And on the screen right now is the statue of the crucified woman, which is at my college, Emmanuel College in Toronto. In her book, Feminist Mysticism and Images of God, A Practical Theology, Jenny Knight explains that while seminary students often express a heartfelt commitment to bringing the feminine images of God from their studies to their congregations, when they begin their ministries, often pressures from their faith communities to maintain exclusively male language for God causes them to leave Christa behind. Even progressive faith communities that strive to use genderless or gender-neutral language for God may shy away from using female God language, preferring to speak of the divine feminine in sermons and teaching exclusively geared towards celebrations of women, such as on Mother's Day. Seminary students who have a deep desire to introduce new language and imagery for the divine encounter resistance from their congregations, when what they truly need is members of their faith community to assist them in the difficult process of examining and playing with images for the divine. And one example of a feminine image of God that would be helpful to bring into this conversation is from a collection of icons created by American artist Kelly Lattimore. Lattimore's body of work is accessible online and features many God images that they hope will challenge our inherited Christian traditions. With the goal of creating more dialogue, Lattimore paints icons of Christ that veer away from the traditionally masculine images of Jesus. They write, I feel the need for new changes. In some icons, I wish to embrace the traditional forms and image, but for many icons, the image needs reshaping, re-imaging, and re-wondering. One of such images presents Christ as a mother hen, with wings spread out to protect her chicks who gather in front of her. Here we see Lattimore bringing Christ's words to life from Matthew 23:7, where Christ longs to gather the children of Jerusalem under his wings like a hen who protects her chicks. Christa here is a fierce mother who will not allow anyone to harm her babies. Why do I believe feminine images of God would be helpful for people with lived experience of mental distress, as well as people who self-injure? Because most of the memoirists whose voices I listened to for my dissertation project have disclosed a history of childhood sexual abuse by a male family member or by other men they encountered as children. Exposing the memoirists to feminine images of the divine could act as an antidote to the omnipotent, exclusively male images of God that are often a part of the Christian tradition, or that may be a part of the memoirist's personal images of God. The image of the hen on your screen functions as a corrective to these images as she gently nurtures and cares for her chicks. When appropriate, images of Christa that show she too has experienced sexual abuse could also be interwoven into the conversation. The God image provided by Marcella Alphus Reed of Christ as a young girl on wearing skirts without underwear is an excellent example of such an image. She writes, quote, "If as a liberationist claim, Christ is neither male nor female in the sense that Christ represents the community of the poor, then Christ should be portrayed as a girl prostituted in Buenos Aires in a public toilet by two men," unquote. Here we see a Christ who shares the pain of the memoirists who have experienced sexual abuse, a Christ who has truly experienced the same traumas that they have. The message that Christ has been where they are, her body sold for sex, is not a common message communicated by the church. Speaking openly about this image of Christ would be helpful in healing for the memoirists and also others who have experienced sexual abuse. One of the memoirists I read for my dissertation, David Finnegan Hosey, includes theological reflection on feminine images of God in his book, Christ on the Psych Ward. In his memoir, David tells the story of the psych ward nurse who he sensed somehow was the embodiment of Christ as she picked him up off the floor when he was experiencing an episode of extreme mental and spiritual distress. And on our screen now is a drawing from Finnegan Hosey's journal that he kept while in the psychiatric hospital. It's an image of Christ standing behind him while he is sitting on the floor, curled up with his hands covering his face. The writing under the image reads, "If you don't think God can be a woman, you've never needed a nurse." Finnegan Hosey continues to reflect upon feminine images of the divine in his memoir, inviting the reader to note instances in the Hebrew scriptures where God is conceived as female, such as when God is imaged as a midwife in Psalm 22 or as a mama bear in Hosea 13. Finnegan Hosey advocates for images of God that are gender fluid and challenge the status quo in order to disrupt a conventional understanding of a masculine God. The final God image I think would be helpful for people who self-injure and others with lived experience of mental distress more broadly is an image of Christ as quote unquote mad, drawing on mad theology literature. The idea that Jesus has lived experience of mental distress is not new, although today may be the first time that you're hearing about it. In the 1930s, Christian chaplain Anton Boysen wondered in his book, The Exploration of the Inner World, if Jesus experienced hallucinations at his baptism, during his temptation in the wilderness, or during the transfiguration. And he asks his readers to consider if this was psychosis. Boysen's questions come out of his own experiences of being hospitalized for what was then known as dementia praecox, which is now called schizophrenia. When he was an inpatient at numerous psychiatric hospitals in the Boston area, he noticed many patients on the wards having hallucinatory episodes similar to those experienced by Christ. And on your screen right now is a photograph of the Boston Psychopathic Hospital around 1922. And this is when Anton Boysen himself was staying there. More recently, Joanna Collicutt has brought attention to the scripture passage contained in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, verse 20 to 21, in which the people around Jesus, even members of his own family, believed that he had, quote unquote, gone out of his mind. Here, Jesus's family seeks to restrain him as he was exhibiting traits of what they believed was a madman. Another theologian who has explored the connection between Christ and madness is Christian chaplain Jeff Hood. In his book, The Psychosis of God, Hood challenges readers to meet the mad God, as God has experienced manic episodes, depression, psychotic breakdowns, and more in the past. Hood believes that God understands what it is to be mentally ill, as mental illness is an integral part of who God is. Hood writes, quote, "A God that is not mentally ill cannot connect with those who are. Those who are mentally ill cannot intimately connect with a God who is not, unquote. Hood writes that he has met with this God, a God who is as, quote, crazy as we are. When I was preparing to teach the class on mental health and Christian theology this past summer, I had a desire to partner the above writings of Boysen, Collicutt, and Hood with an image of Christ that would be meaningful for the students. As I began searching online for a God image that would convey the madness of God, I found an artist's drawing of Jesus wearing a straitjacket. The drawing is in black and white, and Jesus is depicted standing up straight, facing the viewer. His arms are crossed in front of him, held tightly in place by the sleeves of the straitjacket. Multiple straps cross his waist and buckles that prevent him from getting loose. He has a crown of thorns on his head. His facial features are calm. And at last, I felt I had found an image of a mad God that encapsulated all I was looking for. When I presented the image in class during discussion time, some students felt it resonated deeply with them, while others stated clearly the mad Christ made them feel very uncomfortable. I asked the students to sit with the image and to do some silent writing about what feelings the image brought up for them. Some students who had disclosed a history of mental distress, either in their weekly journals or openly to the class, expressed that this Christ felt like home to them, while others stated this image of Christ felt too strange. Although none of the memoirists for my dissertation write about this image of Christ exactly, memoirist David Fitzpatrick writes about his mother's reassuring words that God draws near to those who are hurting in his memoir, Sharp, My Story of Madness, Cutting, and How I Reclaimed My Life. While David is being admitted to the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, he remembers feeling hopeless about his ability to recover from his experiences of intense mental distress and to turn away from his self-injurious behaviors. As he walks to the hospital front desk with his parents to be admitted, he turns to his mother, who is a minister, and asks, "Do you think I will ever get better, Mom?" I asked her. "Oh," she said, speaking slowly and carefully, "you're getting stronger each hour. Start with the days at the beginning. Be thankful for simple breaths, even when you feel awful. Go with that and try to be nice to yourself, okay?" "Sure," I said. "I'll try." "I have faith in you, David," she said. "Remember that God hovers around those who ache." Here we see David's mother reassuring him that God will be present with him inside the Menninger Clinic. During this hospital stay, God does indeed hover around David in the shape of the hospital staff who care for him, in the kind Christian chaplain who brings him communion often, and in the gentle psychiatrist who promises to pray for his healing. These compassionate people are the embodiment of a God who understands David's needs. Perhaps because at one time, the Christ who had gone out of his mind had been there himself. So now I have some questions for quiet reflection that I'm gonna invite everyone to think about for a couple of minutes. So the first question I was hoping you could think about is, what feelings come up for you when you view the image of the mad Christ? And so there's an image of the Christ that I had mentioned before on our screen right now, where he's wearing a straitjacket. So I'll just give you about a minute or so to sort of jot down some thoughts about that, and then we'll proceed to the next question. So the second question that I have for you to think through today is, how does your mental image or understanding of Christ change when you pause to consider that people around him, even his own family members, may have believed him to be mad or crazy? So does this change any of your thoughts around how you image Christ in your mind? And so the final question is, how does this impact how you envision the connection Christ has with those who have lived experience of mental distress? And Candace, I saw your hand up. We'll get to some discussion and questions in just a moment. This is the last question, okay? Okay, so I'm going to invite everyone to come back together now. And I believe we're going to have a time of discussion and questions. So I will stop sharing.